The young and the restless spoilers. The tension in Genoa City was palpable as the one thing Mariah feared most finally came to pass. Aria had been kidnapped. Ian Ward, a man with a dark history and a knack for manipulation, had taken the little girl from her family, leaving chaos and heartbreak in his wake. Although Ian had spirited Aria away to a location unknown, he himself remained in Genoa City, maintaining a facade of innocence. He portrayed himself as a victim, denying any involvement in the kidnapping and claiming he had no idea where Aria was. Mariah was beside herself with grief and rage. The loss of her daughter cut deep, and the uncertainty surrounding Aria's fate made her emotions spiral out of control. Her fury turned outward, and Tessa became the primary target of her anger. Despite Tessa's repeated assurances that she had nothing to do with Aria's disappearance, Mariah's suspicion grew. Every argument between them only widened the rift, as Mariah's desperation clouded her judgment. A city in turmoil. It wasn't just Mariah and Tessa who were caught in this emotional whirlwind. The entire city was shaken. Genoa City residents whispered among themselves, speculating about the motives and players involved. As fingers pointed in all directions, two names rose to the surface: Ian Ward and, unthinkably, Tessa. Tessa's past wasn't spotless, and while she had turned over a new leaf, the weight of her previous misdeeds worked against her. Meanwhile, Ian's reputation as a manipulator with a history of criminal behavior made him a prime suspect. Yet, despite the collective suspicion, there was no concrete proof tying either of them to the crime. The lack of evidence left the police at a standstill, and Mariah's frustration grew by the hour. Mariah and Tessa's once solid relationship was now teetering on the edge of collapse. Every conversation turned into an argument. Mariah's accusations hurt Tessa deeply, but Tessa knew she couldn't focus on the pain. Her priority was finding Aria. She couldn't lose sight of what mattered most: reuniting their family. Ian Ward's game. While Genoa City wrestled with doubt and anger, Ian Ward played his part with chilling precision. He stayed calm, his every move calculated to avoid detection. He even went so far as to insert himself into conversations about Aria's disappearance, portraying himself as just another concerned resident. His words dripped with feigned innocence, but his eyes betrayed the cold cunning of a man who was always 2 steps ahead. Unbeknownst to the city, Ian had kept Aria in a secluded location far from Genoa City. The little girl, far too young to understand the full gravity of the situation, was scared and confused. Ian was careful not to let her suffer physically. He knew Aria was his most valuable bargaining chip. The child's well-being became his ace in the hole, his insurance policy against anyone who might think to cross him. Tessa, refusing to sit idly by, took matters into her own hands. She arranged a secret meeting with Ian, confronting him about Aria's disappearance. Tessa's voice shook with barely contained anger as she demanded that Ian return her daughter. But Ian, ever the master manipulator, refused to budge. He smirked, his confidence unshaken, and laid his terms bare. "You see, Tessa," Ian began, his tone maddeningly casual, "Aria is safe, for now. But if anything happens to me, if I'm arrested or harmed in any way, well, let's just say it wouldn't end well for her." The threat was clear. Ian was holding Aria as leverage, using her to shield himself from the consequences of his actions. Tessa's hands curled into fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms as she fought the urge to lash out. She knew that any move against Ian would have to be carefully planned. Aria's life depended on it. A desperate search. As days turned into weeks, Mariah's resolve hardened. She teamed up with her closest allies to track down Ian's movements. Kevin Fisher, with his tech skills, began digging into surveillance footage and hacking into Ian's communication channels. Sharon, Mariah's mother, provided emotional support while also using her intuition to help piece together the puzzle. Tessa, despite her strained relationship with Mariah, worked tirelessly to follow leads. She reached out to old contacts, desperate for any scrap of information that could lead them to Aria. Her guilt over not being able to protect Aria gnawed at her, but she channeled that pain into action. Meanwhile, Ian grew bolder. He taunted Mariah and Tessa indirectly, leaving cryptic messages and subtle hints that only deepened their anxiety. His ability to stay one step ahead made it clear that this wasn't just a game to him, it was a battle of control. Ian thrived on the chaos he created, relishing the power he held over the lives of others. Aria's plight for Aria, the experience was bewildering and frightening. The young girl missed her mother's comforting embrace and Tessa's soothing voice. Ian, though he provided her with basic necessities, was a poor substitute for the love and care she desperately needed. Aria's innocence became a heartbreaking reminder of the stakes at play. The longer Ian held on to her, the more dangerous the situation became. Ian's overconfidence could lead to mistakes, and Mariah feared what might happen if he felt cornered. Her daughter's life hung in the balance, and every second felt like an eternity. The clock is ticking. Mariah and Tessa knew they needed more than just suspicion to bring Ian down. They needed hard evidence, proof that Ian was the mastermind behind Aria's disappearance. As their allies worked tirelessly to uncover the truth, Mariah and Tessa began to mend their fractured relationship. They realized that if they were to save Aria, they had to stand united. The question loomed large over Genoa City: where was Aria? And how far were Mariah and Tessa willing to go to bring her home? Ian Ward had shattered their lives and pushed them to the brink, but their love for Aria burned brighter than his schemes. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test their strength, resolve, and the bonds that tied them together. Would they outsmart Ian and save Aria, or would his devious plans lead to further heartbreak? The answer remained shrouded in uncertainty, but one thing was clear: this was a fight they couldn't afford to lose. The storm in Genoa City had escalated to a point of no return. Tessa's world, once filled with love and the hope of a happy family, was now crumbling around her. The accusations against her had grown louder, and the people she once considered her allies had turned their backs. Most devastating of all, Mariah, the love of her life, had declared their relationship over. In her grief and rage over Aria's disappearance, Mariah announced that she would strip Tessa of any parental rights. The words cut Tessa like a knife. She felt as though the ground beneath her had disappeared, leaving her to freefall into despair. She had made mistakes, trusting Ian Ward chief among them, but the weight of the consequences now threatened to suffocate her. Alone and abandoned, Tessa wept, her tears carrying the regret of every decision that had led her to this moment. Yet, even as the pain consumed her, she knew she couldn't afford to wallow in self-pity. Aria's life was at stake, and Tessa was determined to do whatever it took to bring her daughter home. A city's fury. The anger directed at Tessa was palpable. Genoa City residents viewed her as complicit in Ian Ward's schemes, regardless of her protests of innocence. Mariah, though heartbroken, made it clear that she held Tessa accountable. "How could you trust him?" Mariah had screamed during their final confrontation. "You let him get close to us. You let him take our daughter." Tessa's attempts to explain? To insist that she had been manipulated, that she had no idea what Ian was planning, fell on deaf ears. The bond she shared with Mariah, once unshakable, was now shattered beyond repair. Even Sharon, who had always been a voice of reason, found it hard to defend Tessa. "I want to believe you," Sharon said gently, "but right now, Mariah is my priority. You need to focus on fixing this, Tessa. Words won't bring Aria back." A mission in isolation. Tessa realized that no one was going to help her. She was on her own. The weight of that realization was crushing, but it also ignited a spark of determination. If she couldn't rely on anyone else, she would find Aria herself. This wasn't about redemption or proving her innocence anymore. This was about saving her daughter from a man who would stop at nothing to maintain his leverage. She began her quest in secret. Every lead she followed, every person she questioned, had to be approached with caution. If Ian caught wind of her efforts, he might decide that Aria was more trouble than she was worth. The thought chilled Tessa to her core, but it only strengthened her resolve. She couldn't afford to make a single mistake. Her search led her to the outskirts of Genoa City, where Ian's old associates operated in the shadows. These were dangerous people, and Tessa knew that approaching them could backfire. Still, she pressed on, her fear outweighed by her desperation. She pieced together bits of information, following a trail that Ian had tried to obscure. Aria's fragile condition meanwhile, Aria's absence was taking a toll not only on her family but also on her health. The little girl, far too young to understand why she had been taken, was struggling in Ian's care. Though he ensured she had food and shelter, Ian's indifference to her emotional and physical needs was glaring. Aria's cries for her mother went unanswered, and her once bright eyes grew dull with confusion and fear. Mariah's worst fears began to manifest. The longer Aria remained in Ian's custody, the more her well-being was at risk. The thought of her daughter suffering, of her small body growing weaker with each passing day, consumed Mariah with guilt and anguish. Even in her anger toward Tessa, Mariah couldn't shake the feeling that they should be fighting this battle together. The turning point: Tessa finally caught a break. Through sheer persistence, she discovered the location of a cabin Ian had been using as a hideout. It was far from Genoa City, secluded and surrounded by dense woods. The perfect place for someone like Ian to disappear. But the knowledge of Ian's location wasn't enough. Tessa needed a plan, and she needed to act fast. She considered reaching out to the police, but the risk was too great. If Ian suspected that law enforcement was closing in, he might harm Aria or vanish with her again. No, this had to be done quietly, carefully. Tessa would have to confront Ian herself, even if it meant putting her own life in danger. A mother's sacrifice under the cover of darkness, Tessa made her way to the cabin. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached, every step heavy with the weight of what she was about to do. She didn't know what she would find inside, whether Aria was safe, whether Ian would be armed, whether she would even make it out alive. But none of that mattered. Her only thought was of her daughter, of the little girl who had brought so much light into her life. When she finally entered the cabin, the sight of Aria nearly brought her to her knees. The girl was curled up on a makeshift bed, her tiny form trembling as she slept. Tessa wanted to rush to her, to scoop her up and hold her close, but she knew she couldn't act rashly. Ian was there, seated in a chair by the window, watching her with a smug expression. Well, Ian said, his voice dripping with mockery. I knew you'd come. A mother's love, so predictable. Tessa's voice trembled as she spoke. Let her go, Ian. She's just a child. She doesn't deserve this. Ian chuckled, shaking his head. And what about me, Tessa? Do I deserve to be hunted, locked away like an animal? Aria is my insurance policy. As long as I have her, no one can touch me. But Tessa wasn't deterred. She stepped closer, her eyes locked on Ian's. You don't need her. I'll stay. Whatever you want, whatever you need, just let her go. Please. Ian hesitated, surprised by the sincerity in Tessa's voice. For a moment, it seemed as though he might consider her offer. But before he could respond, a noise from outside startled him. It was Kevin, who had been tracking Ian's movements and had called the authorities. The escape in the chaos that followed, Tessa seized the opportunity to grab Aria and run. Ian, realizing he was cornered, tried to stop them, but Tessa's determination gave her strength. She fled into the night with Aria in her arms, tears streaming down her face as she whispered reassurances to her daughter. By the time the police arrived, Ian was gone. But Tessa didn't care. She had Aria, and that was all that mattered. As mother and daughter were reunited, Tessa knew her journey was far from over. She still had to face the consequences of her past actions, to rebuild the trust she had lost. But for now, she allowed herself to savor the moment, the sweet relief of holding her child once again.